Let's cross live now to Baku in Azerbaijan, where SABC News reporter Samkele Maseko is standing by for us. Samkele, a very good afternoon to you. Thank you so much for your time. Delegates there expected to negotiate a new collective quantified goal to ensure that climate finance targets address the needs of developing countries for mitigation, adaptation and the loss as well as damage. It's been something that has been in the works over time now. This is definitely one of the big sticking points.
Indeed, Bongiwe, this is definitely one of the biggest sticking points in these particular negotiations and deliberations around the new NCGQs, and in particular on the loss fund, that loss and recovery fund that is being purported and being touted upon by developing countries, on how developed countries once promised that they would contribute $100 billion into the just transition, and saying that they need to go through that particular spreadsheets and how these developing countries have contributed to that particular fund. Many developing countries have said that the developed countries have not yet trickled down those particular funds. They are coming in slowly but surely. But also on this particular loss fund, developing countries are saying they need about $1.5 trillion in order to implement the just transition within their particular countries, saying they don't need these particular funds to be loans, but they need them to be grants. Bongi, we also do know that the Minister of Fisheries Environment within the country, Dr. John George, will be co-chairing the Mitigation Commission alongside his Norway counterpart, which is looking at that particular $1.5 trillion that will be the fund that will be used for mitigation of this global crisis of climate change.
Samkele, these agreements are crucial, especially when you look at the impact that has been felt by the developing countries when it comes to climate change. And certainly, no doubt, there now needs to be some decisive action as opposed to just conversations.
Indeed, Bongiwa, these deliberations are going to be very sticky. Particularly, it is being set up as if it's going to be a huge tussle between the developed nations, the developed North, versus the developing South. And that is where the developing South is saying that the developed North has had ample time to burn coal over a period of a number of years, and the developing South is not going to be able to burn as much coal that they need in order to keep the lights afloat, in order to keep their economies going. For instance, if we take South Africa as an example, the automotive sector within South Africa is faced with a huge challenge, particularly when you look at how the developing North, and particularly the European Union, has set up measures in order to block out those products that are largely containing carbon emissions within their own nations, that they will not be able to import those particular products, knowing of the exposure of carbon that they have, and that will affect negatively the South African automobile sector, which is where the National Business Initiative comes into the fore, in saying that as South Africa battles between a base load of coal, it also faces the threat of losing its markets in the automobile sector if it does not reduce its carbon content in some of its products that it manufactures and exports from South Africa.
And listening to the opening of the South African pavilion a little earlier on, it does seem that South Africa does have some, focus points that it would like to also bring to the table in these particular negotiations as well.
South Africa does have some of its own issues that it wants to bring out to the fore. One of those is this particular issue of the just transition, how just it is, and how the AU nations have, in essence, decided to infringe on the sovereignty of individual member states when it comes to their just transition, particularly within the automobile or automotive sector, knowing that South Africa is one of the dominant players, it is one of the key anchors of the South African economy, and how these particular products will will pretty much not become competitive in the global space. In the EU continues with their particular restrictions that they've put in place for countries that have huge carbon contents on some of their products that they are exporting into the European Union. That is going to be one of the sticky points here at this COP29, which will be deliberating on those particular measures that these countries are now fusing in with some of the high content of carbon emissions that these countries are generating in some of their exports, which is some of the issues that the EU has placed to the fore as the world moves into the electric vehicles.
And Samkele, of course, the climate financing countries themselves need to also say how they're raising this money in order to be able to deal with some of the challenges that are faced by developing nations as well, and also make some concessions where there needs to be, but also say precisely how much are they going to be able to raise and be able to distribute.
Indeed, Bongi, where everybody will have to make concessions at some point in time. Not only the developed nations, but also the developing nations will have to make concessions of their own. We did speak to the Minister, Dr. Dion George, who said that China must not be classified as a developed nation. China is a developing nation, and thus South Africa has clubbed up, decided to defend China, which is part of the BRICS family of countries that South Africa belongs to. But also, when you look at some of the issues being raised in the just transition, you look at the automotive sector within South Africa, you look at how South Africa has a base load of coal, you look at the formal and informal sectors within the automotive sector within the country. If you decide to move away from the carbon intensive manufacturing plants within South Africa, the carbon vehicles that we currently have, which is being manufactured in South Africa currently, what do you say about those who form part of the informal sector of bush mechanics? What do you say about the petrol attendants? Where does that labor force go? Are you taking them out of the economic sector of the country, further perpetuating unemployment, poverty and inequality? Or how do you upskill them as well? Which is some of the issues that come in mitigation, which is where Dr. Dion George, the minister, will be co-chairing with his counterpart of Norway. That's going to be a very sticky point for South Africa because it looks to protect its automotive sector, its markets that it currently has, but also not wanting to create a jobs bloodbath and a ghost town when it comes to the mining sector of coal.
And especially because some of these very countries themselves that are considered developed are seemingly turning towards this method of coal in order to be able to deal with some of the energy challenges that they are facing themselves. But let's leave it there with you for now. Hopefully catch up a little later on. That's Samkele Maseko, the SABC News reporter, live for us in Baku in Azerbaijan.